G'day mate, 40 here. So I'm quite entranced by this essayist Seymour Krim. And in particular, I like an essay he wrote for my brothers and sisters in the failure business. And it's included in many essay collections, including The Art of the Personal Essay. So Seymour Krim notes, we are all victims of the imagination in this country. So I don't think we inherently need to be victims of the imagination. Maybe we can't handle the imagination, some of us. The American dream may seem like a dirty joke these days. Well, it depends for whom. This is still the land of opportunity, the world's best and brightest. Doggone it. Am I muted? Nope, I'm back. So the best and the brightest still want to come here from all over the world. So I'm not sure the American dream really seems like a dirty joke, but I understand perhaps it's just for certain people the American dream seems like a dirty joke. Now, perhaps the best way to introduce Seymour Krim is to note that there was a music group formed called Seymour and the Krims. And they didn't do much, but
there are many dreams we gave up on.
Talking like a very sick
But sin came back to mind in Bennington. Under the soul tree. Under the soul tree. I'm back together.
Can I get a medium coffee, cream only?
With my failures. They're like little children. All my failures. But I still have a dream. 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 I still have a dream.
So Krimtastic, this song examines the questions we ask daily. Have we failed or succeeded? Or are we just like everyone else? Are we just dreamers? So Seymour Krim was an essayist. He lived from 1922 until 1989. He grew up and fell in love with the great American realistic novel of the late 1930s. And he thought he was going to grow up to be a novelist, but that did not.
Adam Sandler came to make a movie in a little town called Swampscott, Mass.
So Sandler Town is an entry to a world of hubris and fakery. Join us in this path toward liberation from falsehood to truth. All right, back to Seymour Krim. Wrote a lot of essays for Playboy magazine and the Village Voice. And perhaps his best-known essay is To My Brothers and Sisters in the Failure Business. We're all victims of the imagination in this country. The American dream may sometimes seem like a dirty joke these days, but it was internalized long ago by our fevered little minds, and it remains to haunt us as we fumble with the unglamorous pennies of life during the illusionless middle years. So usually in your teens and 20s, most of us have grandiose expectations and overly generous assessments of our own skills. But then as we hit our 30s and 40s, we tend to start to drop these illusions. Life beats them out of us. So Seymour Krim writes this essay at age 51. I'm 54. At 51, I still don't know truly what I want to be. I've published several serious books. I rate an inch in Who's Who in America. I teach at a respected university, but in that profuse upstairs delicatessen of mine, I'm as open to every wild possibility as I was at 13. Although even I know that the chances of acting them out diminish with each heartbeat. So I suspect he's not married with children. I think most people get their meaning in life from their family, through creating a family, from friends, and from community. So if you're a Jew, you'll probably get a great deal of your meaning from belonging to the Jewish people. If you're a Christian, you'll get a great deal of your meaning from being a Christian. If you're a writer, I expect you'll get a great deal of your meaning from being a writer. But most people, I think, get most of their meaning from creating a family. One life was never quite enough of what I had in mind. So everyone dies frustrated. I mean, even Moses does not even get into the promised land. So we're all a little bit like Moses. None of us are going to get into the promised land in this life. So how do we make peace with failure and frustration? Because all of us are going to experience a great deal of it. At 50, my father was as built in as a concrete foundation. At 55, he was crushed out of existence by the superstructure of his life. I have no superstructure except possibly in my head. So this is not someone who's created a family, not someone who's married with kids. I live alone with my fierce dreams and my possessions are few. So maybe the book of Genesis is right. Maybe God is right when he says in the book of Genesis, it's not good for man to be alone. So Seymour Krim, I think, feels fairly crushed by his loneliness. My possessions are few. My father knew where he stood, having come from an Iron Cross Europe. I only know that I stand today with a silent prayer that tomorrow will bring to me my revelation and miracleize me. So I think most people calm down after they build a family. But if you don't have a family, then the books you write and your career, if you're a man, is most likely going to be your primary source of meaning. That's because I come from America, which has to be the classic, ultimate, then they broke the mold incubator of not knowing who you are until you find out. Well, if you have a strong identity as a Jew or as a Christian or as a father, I've never really found out. So this guy is secular. So this is one of the downsides to being secular. I expect what remains of my life to be one long search party for the final me. And it turned out to be a fairly demoralizing end. He had health problems and finally committed suicide in 1989. I don't kid myself that I'm alone in this. I don't really think that the great day will ever come when I hold a finished me in my fist and say, here you are, congratulations. Well, this is one of the downsides of having a focus on yourself. If you create a family, then you can't truly afford to keep the focus on yourself. Your focus is likely going to be on your kids and on your spouse. I'm talking primarily about the expression of that me in the world, the shape it takes, the profile it zings out, the work it does. So most people don't get to do satisfying, exciting work creating a profile that just zings out into the world. You may sometimes think everyone lives in the crotch of the pleasure principle these days except you, but you have company, friend. So do you feel like you live in the crotch of the pleasure principle? So yeah, I think it's a very human tendency is that we all think other people are having far more pleasure than we are. Press 1 if you are living in the crotch of the pleasure principle. I live under the same pressures you do. It is still your work or role that finally gives you your definition in our society. Well, I think for most people, again, it's their family. And the thousands upon thousands of people who I believe are like me, those who have never found the professional skin to fit the riot in their souls. So press 2 if you've never found the professional skin to fit the riot in their souls. I feel like I have found the professional skin to fit the riot in my soul. Live streaming, blogging, ta-da, teaching the Alexander technique. Many never will. I think I will speak for some of their secret life and for that other side of America you don't hear too much about. This isn't presumption so much as a voice of scars and stars talking. I've lived it, and I will go on living it until they take away my hot dog. Consider a boy at the turn of the 1930s growing up in this land without parents. He's talking about himself here. So he was born in 1922, without discipline, without any religion to speak of. Again, this is key. I think one of the benefits of having religion is that you usually get a sense of meaning and a sense of community and a sense of identity to come with it. And it also encourages you to create a family. So I think people choose what kind of sex life they want. So if people want a monogamous sex life where they create a family, then they're far more likely to be religious. And if people just want to bang, then they're less likely to be religious. If you just want to bang, probably going to choose a more secular life. So he grew up with a famished need that almost unconsciously filled the vacuum where the solid family heart should be, the dizzying spectacle of his senses. So yeah, we were wired to connect, but if we're not able to connect with other people, then we're going to connect with fantasies or with substances or processes. So this is a guy who apparently grew up a little bit like myself, somewhat awkward at connecting with other people. And instead, he would learn to dull his pain by connecting with fantasy. America anchored a kid as you can conceive of, an open fuse box of blind yearning, and out of what I now assume was unimaginable loneliness and human hunger, I greedily tried on the personalities of every type on the national scene, as picked up through newspapers, magazines, movies, radio, and just nosing around. So if you're connected to other people, you're going to fairly quickly find out who you are, because who we are is something that's learned through our connections with other people. I am different because you are there and you are talking to me in the chat. So I have a unique relationship with you, and you bring out a unique side of me. Right? So I am who I am due to my relationship with my brother, with my sister, with my stepmother, with my friends, with my Rebbe, with my synagogue, with my clients, with my community, right? We know each other through our relationships and connections. And if you're lacking in that department, then there's going to be a lot of emptiness and fantasy. What a juicy parade through any inexperienced and wildly applauding mind America was then. What a nonstop variety show of heroes, adventurers, fabulous kinds of human beings to hook onto if you're totally on your own without any guidance and looking for your star in a society that almost drove you batty with desire. So I don't think it's America that's going to drive you batty with desire. It is lack of connection with other people that's going to unleash a yearning for connection. If you're not able to connect with people, then you're going to connect with fantasies, substances, or processes.
It was a real big Hollywood production, and an even bigger pain in the ass. The town was so enamored with his fame, they decided to change my hometown's name to Sandler Town.
Sandler Town.
But they came to turn.
So some people get a feeling of meaning or connection in life through connecting with imaginary film stars, with fantasies. So that's one way to get connection. where you can connect with like flesh and blood live streamers. In my earnest role playing, the philosophical tramp and the cool millionaire playboy was second nature to me, as were the style and stance of ball players, barnstorming pilots, polar explorers, radio personalities, generals, bridge building engineers, treasure hunters, crooners, inventors. So I noticed in my life growing up that when I felt connected to people around me, I kind of calmed down and I lived much less in fantasy. And the more disconnected I was from the people around me, then much more I lived in fantasy and behaved in weird attention-seeking ways. So connection, I find, calms down the yearnings that this author describes. I don't go batty with desire when I have friends and community in my life. I wanted to be Glenn Cunningham, Kid Chocolate, Shandu the Magician, Eugene O'Neill, a gangbuster. If you're old enough, tick off the names of the big shots of the time and see Seymour Krim impersonating them in his private magic theater. So this is Seymour Krim, I believe, writing in the 1980s, just a few years.
The whole place upside down. Sandler Town. Sandler.
Okay, Sandler Town. All right, this is Seymour Krim writing a few years before he committed suicide. Later on, when I'd lost my adolescent shame, knew myself to be a freak of the imagination, even wallowed in it, I identified with women like Amelia Earhart and even the hot, ripe, early pinup girl Iris Adrian, and transvestited my mind to see the world through their long lashes and tough lace. So the more time you spend on your own, the more time you spend in your fantasies, the more extreme and weird they're going to get. Democracy means democracy of the fantasy life too. There are no cops crouching in the corridors of the brain. So there's something called maladaptive daydreaming. That's when you spend too much time in fantasy. Dr. Freud's superego hasn't been able to pull its old country rank over here, even though it's tried like a mother, or should I say a father. But a great fitting room for experimentation, a huge sci-fi lab for making the self you wanted. America was for those of us who needed models, forms, shapes we could throw ourselves into. Well, this is particularly if you don't have an identity, which usually comes from family and from religion and from tradition and from community. Everyone from my generation didn't chuck caution out the window, even if they felt the lure, as I did, of a new make-your-own life-size man era. So from my experience traveling the world, there does feel like there's more freedom in the United States. You can be religious or you can be atheist, you can be straight or you can be gay, you can be male or you can be female, right? Doesn't the Declaration of Independence state that one of our fundamental rights is the pursuit of happiness? And this can drive you crazy. It's not a pursuit that everyone is cut out for. Some of my more realistic contemporaries narrowed it all down early, became the comparative successes they are today. So yeah, I noticed in my 20s that I felt very comfortable with my peer group. But then as people moved into their 30s, their careers took off. They got married. They had kids. They took on mortgages. They developed prestige, an important place in the community. This is an essay addressed to for my brothers and sisters in the failure business by Seymour Krim, published just a few years before he committed suicide. Whether it's making a lot of money selling scrap in a junkyard or writing thrillers for connoisseurs of kinkiness, such as Patricia Highsmith, they all had to focus clearly and work hard. Yes, the problem is not that life is absurd. The problem is not that life makes no sense. The problem is that problem for some of us is that life does not make perfect sense. But generally speaking, if you make good choices and you work hard, you will achieve success. Now, there's not a perfect correlation, but that is the overwhelming tendency. So if you think, oh, life is just so absurd, there's just no correlation between doing the right thing and experiencing reward, I would argue to you, it's not that life is absurd, is that life just doesn't 100% make sense. Life makes about 90% sense. As traps and frustration of age 51 close down around me, with all the small defects and petty hurts that sometimes seem to choke away all thoughts of the unique Homeric journey of the inner person in America, everyone's inner person, I salute them for achieving some of what they wanted. Okay, so we can become trapped by our resentments and our angers and our frustrations. So it all depends upon our point of view. I don't feel trapped, not consciously, by my anger, frustration, resentment, failure, humiliation. Now, I occasionally think of some things I've said and done, and I still wince. So I remember we had a good friend of the family who was staying with us for a few days when I think I was in something like 7th grade. And after about a week, I said to the guy, how much longer are you going to stay here eating our food? And this was just like a terrible thing to say. I mean, this was a good friend of the family. I had no reason to say this. It was a horrible thing. Yeah, welcome to the party, guys. What do I find compelling about this? I just think he phrases it beautifully. Who else do you think has phrased it better than this? Good old Seymour Krim here. Nobody gets it all, but I salute anyone in this bewildering dreamland of a nation who has managed to cut through the wilderness of tangled trails to some definite cabin of achievement and reward. So look, bro, this is reprinted in many essay collections. This is in The Art of the Personal Essay. I mean, this is The Art of the Personal Essay collects the best personal essays over the past 500 years. And this essay is there. Yet those of us who have never really nailed it down, who have charged through life from enthusiasm to enthusiasm, that's me. So I'm an intellectual gigolo. I fall in love with beautiful idea after beautiful idea, but ultimately I stay loyal to none. I'm someone who's perpetually enthused about one thing or another. I am a serial enthusiast. So I lack the Sitzfleisch, the ability to just sit in one place and work hard in a definite direction. Like even my shows are all over the map, ricocheting from one topic to another. They make sense to me. But this guy, like me, is charged through life from enthusiasm to enthusiasm, from new project to new project, from personality revolution to personality revolution. But he has a secret too. It's not the kind that desperate people can use to improve themselves like those ads in the newspaper. It's the kind that people in my league that have very leaky boots often take to psychiatrists, hoping to simplify their experience because they can't cope with the murderous tangle of it. So yeah, we all want to make sense of our own life, and that's what we spend most of our conscious mental power doing, trying to make sense, create a story, create coherence for what is otherwise an incoherent life. For those of us who have lived through each twist and turn, the psychiatry sessions, the occasional abyss, the endless review of our lives to see where we went wrong, then come to see our natures as strange and special manifestations of a time and place that will never come again, there is a wonder in it that almost makes up for the beating we're beginning to take at the hands of the professional heavyweight world. So Seymour Krim was an essayist from the Beats era. He wrote a lot for The Village Voice and for Playboy. A secret is that we still have an epic longing to be more than what we are. So I was watching a talk on marketing, and the talk said, when you market to people, don't market to people as they are, such as insurance agent or a cashier, but market to people as they want to be. Oh no, Ricardo has the COVID, 102-degree fever. Wow, blessings to you, Ricardo. That doesn't sound like any fun. Do you know who gave it to you? Do you know who we can blame? Is it just the flu, bro, or does it seem a little bit more serious than just the flu? So this show is for my brothers and sisters in the failure business. So press 1 if you are a brother or a sister in the failure business. No, not fun at all. 102 degrees is burning up. So if you still press one, if you still have an epic longing to be more than what you are, to multiply yourself, to integrate all the identities and action fantasies you have experienced, to keep experimenting with your life all the way to Forest Lawn, cemetery, to see how much you can make real out of that prolific American dream machine within. So I so identify with this. Our true projects have finally been ourselves. So I've had several people comment to me that, like, 40, your life is performance art. It's as if we have taken literally the old cornball land of opportunity slogan and incorporated it into the pit of the being instead of the space around us. Fallen so much in love with the ongoing excitement of becoming, even the illusion of becoming, that our pants often fall down and reveal our dirty skivvies and skinny legs. The laughter hurts, believe me, but it doesn't stop us for very long. We were hooked early. So we have to be hooked on something. Normally you get hooked on having a family, building a career, being part of a religion, and carrying on a tradition. But if you don't have that, and Seymour Krim doesn't have that, he was essentially an orphan. He was raised in a secular world. He remained secular his entire life, so he wasn't rooted to anything. So he ends up being rooted to his fantasies about what he could become. So we live life looking forward. And so when we live life looking forward, we just see all this infinity of possibilities. But we understand our life looking backward. When we look back on our life, then we see, oh, we did not really have as many possibilities as we thought at the time. So in the present, we feel like we have free will. But when we look back, we see how much more circumscribed our choices are. Oh, no. Oh, no. Poor Ricardo. It's not as bad as the flu, says Ricardo. The price of failure is death. Krem summed up, losing is bad. So half Galician hasn't even read the essay, but he can already sum it up. And no, that's not the summary of the essay. It is reaching out to those who are still dreaming and urging them to take solace from their triumphs. And just, I don't know, I feel like the very air changes when I encounter the truth. And this essay, to me, has the profound ring of truth. The America of the pioneers being made subjective by us. The endless rolling back of the frontier goes on within our heads all the time. We are the updated Daniel Boones of American inner space. So there is much more sense of freedom and possibility and striving. Americans work harder than any other nation, take fewer vacation days than any other nation. We move more than almost any other nation. Each of our lives seems to us a novel or a play or a movie. Yeah, I've often walked through my day just imagining, oh, what would this look like if it was filmed, if this was a movie? Draining our energy, but then at other moments lifting us up to spectacular highs, yet always moving, the big wagon train of great new possibilities always crushing on. So you can get high on fantasy. I know that I've spent much of my life just getting high on my fantasies. But then, like with all highs, there are crashing lows. That all of this is private doesn't make it any less real. What it does do is make us ache with hopelessness at times as to how to find a vocation for this private super adventure serial out on the streets of life. Well, there's a title of a book which perhaps best addresses this. Real artists have day jobs. So if you don't depend upon paying your bills by making your dreams come true, if you instead are pragmatic, pay your bills through more conventional means, then you free up time to make your dreams come true. And then when you pursue your dreams in your spare time, you're not constantly worrying about paying the bills. I wanted to become a novelist in my teens just so that I could be all these different personalities and events. It was physically impossible for me to be any other way. So in 8th grade, I wanted to become a journalist because I saw journalism as my ticket to the inner party, that it was my press pass to what was really going on. At least Ricardo is going to be immune in 10 days. I feel that the writing of the realistic novel in America, and they were usually one and the same with the romantic novel, the hairy details were just used to tack down the sweep of imagination, came out of these basic human needs to transcend the one body and temperament you were born with, to mingle imaginatively with a cast of thousands that could only exist in a monster country like ours. So I wonder if people in Europe feel this as keenly, because usually people in Europe live and die within a few miles of where their ancestors lived. So people in Europe tend to have a much stronger attachment to a particular place. And so their choices are more limited, but they have a stronger sense of identity. Others wanted to become actors for the same reason, to impersonate all the people they could not be. But in my life, I wanted to compose the script itself so that I could participate in the minds as well as the actions of characters who are all extensions of myself and my own mad love affair with the fabulous diversity of this society. So I don't know, when I watch a sporting event, I vicariously feel like it's me throwing the football and catching the football and throwing the baseball and hitting the baseball and catching the baseball and running around the bases. When I watch a movie, I feel like I'm in the movie. So I'm sure there are other ways to watch sports and to watch movies, but it's always me vicariously up on the screen. I never accepted the discipline or the belief in a pure fiction separate from myself. And I never became the marvelous novelist of my teenage ambition. But I was an inward novelist. Just as so many young kids today shoot movies in their heads with themselves as the leading character. So we never got a TV until 1980 when I was 14. I graduated 8th grade. And at that same time, we moved out of the Seventh-day Adventist Church into a more diffuse, non-denominational evangelical Christian community that wasn't as real and specific a community as the Seventh-day Adventist one I had prior to that. So the television from age 14 on became much more real for me, and God and religion and my religious community became much less real. And so from age 14 to 18, TV steadily gained in importance, and the world it pictured steadily gained in importance as my contact with God and with community diminished in importance. And so I started to put more and more priority on being on TV, being famous, getting with beautiful women, and being on 60 Minutes. It's just an accident of history that made me good at words instead of the sounds and pictures, which are the newest language. But I feel a little superiority at being able to pitch a word or two compared to those in other ways who are tongue-tied. So yeah, we all enjoy our particular strengths. For some people it's rapping, for others it's playing basketball, for some people it's live streaming, for other people it's writing. What unites us all is that we never knew, except in bits and pieces, how to find a total expression appreciated by our peers, which we could deliver ourselves of all the huge and contradictory desires we felt within. Well, I assume for most people, if you start a family, that absorbs most of your energy. Starting a family and then supporting a family, I think for most men will absorb most of this energy and these desires to find a total expression for all the huge and contradictory desires you feel within, that becomes much less important because you simply don't have the energy and you don't have the mental space. You're spending your time, how am I going to pay this bill? How are we going to pay for braces for the kid? How are we going to pay for private school for the kid? Country was too rich and confusing for us to want to be one thing at the expense of another. We were the victims of our enormous appreciation of it all. So I don't think people are victims of the enormous possibilities in America. I think people are victims of unconscious ways of reacting to stimuli that don't serve them. So some people learn to reduce their pain through fantasy. Other people learn to reduce their pain through smoking cigarettes or overeating or watching pornography or drinking too much. And these are techniques at dealing with frustration in life that don't tend to work out real well in the long term. But if you create a family or you're part of a community, you have friends, you feel connected to a chain of tradition, I don't think these fantasies are going to get the better of you as likely. With words coming easily to me, I began in my 20s a long string of never totally satisfying jobs. Well, what kind of person looks to a job to totally satisfy them? Right? I mean, I think a Christian looks to Jesus as a source of satisfaction and connection, and a Jew looks to the Torah, and Muslims look to their tradition. So I think most people get their sense of satisfaction from their identity as a Christian, as a Jew, as a Korean. people get satisfaction from building a family and from having friends and being part of a community. So this guy was disappointed that none of his jobs totally satisfied him. Beginning Office of War Information rewrite man, assistant pulp editor, that means cheap books, motion picture publicity writer, motion picture script reader, book reviewer, finally editor of a magazine. I was always looking past them. Well, it kind of reminds me of my relationships. I was often lining up the next relationship while I was still in one because I was a love addict. I needed that constant thrill of falling in love, the excitement of the chase, finally seducing the woman. And then once I got her, I'd start looking for the next woman. When I heard a great black blues singer, I wanted to incorporate that sound in me. I even tried singing in Greenwich Village. When I saw a handsome movie star close up, I thought that was my birthright. Also, went to a plastic surgeon to try to make me look more like this example of male beauty. So this is someone who lacks an inner core, doesn't really know who he is in life. So one of the downsides of secularism. When I had saturated myself with the brilliant records of Lenny Bruce and Lord Buckley, I thought that I too should improvise in a nightclub. I even played a small engagement in the Midwest to painfully act this dream out. I once tried stand-up comedy, and I didn't know what I was doing. And it was really bad. Really bad. Half Galician says, sounds like bipolarity, flights of fantasy and depths of despair. In the future, we will understand this through a chemical lens. Now we still grasp for subjective experience narrative. Guess what? There will never be a time when we're not interested in a subjective experience narrative, and there will never be a time when we understand the yearnings of the human heart purely in terms of chemicals. Bernard says, I live 2 to 3 miles from my ancestor John Svensson, who settled here 400 years ago. Whatever I saw that was good in others and which I didn't possess, I tried to add to my nature, to graft it onto the living flesh. Yeah, this is the human condition. We're much more likely to try to add than subtract. It seemed to me that the American society was a launching pad for the endless development of the self. Well, if you're not connected, then it can very much be a launching pad for the endless development of the self, particularly the 1970s were the me decade. I think prior to the 1960s, America was more homogeneous. It had more social cohesion, social trust. People had a better idea of who they were. We cared more about trying to enlarge and extend the boundaries of being what we were, of demonically sucking all of the country's possibilities into ourselves than we did about perfecting a single craft or profession. Well, people who fail at life, this is their approach. So I remember my therapist said that when I talked to her, she'd get the image of a starving child just relentlessly sucking on a woman's breast with such a ferocity because the infant did not know when the next feeding would come. And so my girlfriends often found that I would just absolutely exhaust them. I would just had a bottomless pit need for stroking and nurture. It was a beautiful, breathless eagerness for all the life we could hoard inside, packed layer on layer like a bulging quart container of ice cream. So I found the technique of subtraction really helped me rather than simply always trying to graft on and add on and add on. So with the Alexander technique, for example, it's a technique of subtraction where you notice your unhelpful responses to stimuli and learn to let go of them. Granted, it was the most rank kind of selfishness and self-absorption. Yeah, so guess what? Selfishness and self-absorption does not create a life that works. Yet this too was forecast and made part of the national inheritance in 1870 when Walt Whitman chanted, "Oneself I sing, a simple separate person, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse." That's what this democracy was for us, a huge supermarket of mass man, where we could take a piece here and a piece there to make our personalities for ourselves that are putting up with what was given at the beginning. Well, I think E.O. Wilson was much more profound when he said that we're essentially film negatives, and then you can develop the film in a good way or a mediocre way or a bad way, but we can never develop past what's on the negative. So the film negative refers to our genetic structure. This lovely idea became for some of us a tragedy, released a terrible confusion that wasn't counted on at the beginning. When do you stop making a personality? Well, once you recognize the importance of genetics and early imprinting, you understand that our scope for choice is much more narrow than what this essayist Seymour Krim describes. When do you stop fantasizing an endless you and try to make it with what you've got? Well, I think if you develop a family, if you're part of a tradition, if you have a strong identity, then you're not going to be as focused on yourself. The answer is never. You keep adding and subtracting from that creation, which is yourself, until the last moment. Well, we really know ourselves in connection to other people. So it's in our connections with other people, it's in the families and communities that we build that we get our strongest sense of identity. Once begun, it is not a habit that can be given up easily. Well, if you get more important obligations, such as building a family, just playing a significant role in your community, just taking on volunteer functions where you are important in people's lives, that can help you to get out of this trap. Some people who started off this risky life game with high hopes found that after a while they're unable to live with the self they began with and unable to come close to the selves they desired to be. They live in pain. Some are no longer living at all, having found it too bitter to take. Yeah, so a life of fantasy, initially it's a quick way to ease the pain, but it does not tend to be a life that works. Because of fluency with words, I was able to express my own longings and desires with personal statements in print as the years went by. I wasn't as completely frustrated as those other dreamers I know who've run the gamut of jobs and flings at movies, writing, dancing, politics, and yet have never found a home to match their imaginations. Well, most people don't find a home in their job. For most people, a job is a way to pay the bills so that they can build a home with other people. They never found a form to contain them, or have only caught it momentarily and then it was gone. Well, for most people, they find a form to contain them in family, in community, and in religion, and in their hobbies. During my 20s and 30s, even into my 40s, it was exhilarating to learn and to be involved at that steaming source, the partisan review brigade of radical intellectuals. So the people on the right, they tend to have a skeptical view of human nature, so I think they're going to be much less susceptible to the dreaming that Seymour Krim is describing. People on the left tend to have a much more optimistic view of human nature, and so they're going to spend much more time fantasizing about human possibilities that are not realistic. So Seymour Krim was a part of the Beat generation. Then he had a wonderful fling at daily newspaper reporting on the New York Herald Tribune with Tom Wolfe, then the breakthrough of the new journalism. I was confident, as are all American nomads, of the jeweled highways of the imagination, that there would be a sudden confluence of all the roads at some fated point, then I would put it all together with a gorgeous thunderclap. So this is the downside of being alone in the world and spending so much time with your fantasies. No soap. All of this can conceivably happen, but the mathematics are against you as time goes by. Yet time is just that factor we don't want to hear about until it elbows us in the nose. So it feels a little bit about like those guys in their 40s and 50s still going to discos, trying to pick up young women. We know all along that time is squeezing us into a corner, while we mentally rocket to each new star that flares across our sky, and yet we can't help ourselves. We forget that our contemporaries are building up wealth of one kind or another, reputations, consistency, credit in the world, and that it counts for more as age settles down around all of us, the very age we have denied or ignored. So he's talking about lives that work versus lives that don't work. Those of us who have lived higher in the mind than on the sidewalk, making and revising our salad of possibilities, have stayed younger than we should have, more immature than we should have. We've even been sealed off from our own image as it's seen by others. So, in other words, removed from reality. Yet each of us sooner or later gets the elbow that reminds us that the real world we have postponed making a deal with. So it's like people in their 40s still trying to make it as an actor with virtually no success for 2 or 3 decades. So the real world that we have postponed making a deal with. In other words, we've not settled down to a job that pays the bills in a reliable fashion. We have played like Charlie Chaplin, kicking the globe around in The Great Dictator. We've been evaluating ourselves with a different set of standards than the standards that other people apply to us. So if you behave, if you experience like Seymour Krim, then you're going to get to your 50s and find that other people have no expectations for you. The other people have essentially written you off. We've been snotty towards ordinary success, proud and mysterious as we have followed the inner light, even making thoughtless cracks about those who settle for little. Then the day always comes when our own inability to put it all together is seen by another who wants to cut us down to size, and our lives suddenly explode in our faces. Well, your life is only going to explode in your own face if you've been living in fantasy. So other people can only cut you down to size if you're not living in reality. So this is Seymour Krim's great essay for my brothers and sisters in the failure business. I was living in Europe at the time, where the attitude towards personal success and failure is much less of a real distinction than over here because of the even-handed wounds of recent history. I don't think it's the even-handed wounds of recent history. It's that people in Europe find identity much easier to come by because people in Europe tend to live very close to where their ancestors lived. Everyone was badly hurt by the war. Even today, one man's fate counts for less than some kind of minimum well-being for the masses of people who are trapped by political and economic circumstances beyond their control, must learn to live cheerfully if possible without much hope for large personal triumphs. Well, when you have a strong identity, that means that you're part of a group, and so your own personal fortunes are less important to you. You get more of your meaning from belonging to the group. It is a relief for Americans who come from a society that glorifies individual achievement, the aching and breaking point, to live over there for a while, try to recuperate from the American heat in a different psychological climate. Many of our permanent expatriates are just the kind of people I've been talking about, a band who have never found themselves by our official standards, perhaps never will, but who can live at peace beyond our shores with less money and less strain than at home. So Americans tend to work quite hard. Americans take fewer vacation days than any other nation. America is a competitive place. There are other places to live that are much less competitive. I too have been unkinked in this easier, we're all fucked together, so let's make the best of it environment. Self-lured into thinking I was as rich and potential a human gold mine as I always believed. If you get into reality, you realize that you're not such a human gold mine. That there's probably some gold in there, but also a lot of dross and some coal. As all of us in my camp want to believe, when the dirty American word failure winged its way across the water and hit me where it hurts. So I don't find failure hurts me nearly as much anymore. I mean, when you come to terms with reality, when you make peace with who you are and what you've done and with the world that's going on around you, when you keep your focus on taking the actions on things that you can change and developing serenity about the things you can't change, then you're not going to be as susceptible to these dramatic ups and downs. It suddenly and brutally defined to me the price I had paid for my bid to be everything that proposed itself to my imagination. So yeah, a life focused on self is not generally a life that works. Maybe I never had a choice. Maybe I would have been an uncertain performer at whatever I did. But my decision to aim at the stars had been a conscious one. This was the way it was being weighed on the common man's do it or shut up scale. So he's not putting sufficient weight in his own inability to see reality and on his own genetic predispositions, which limits what he can be good at. But if you are a proud, searching failure in this society, we can take ironic comfort in the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of us, then it is smart and honorable to know what you attempted and why you're now vulnerable to the body blows of those who once saw you robed in the glow of your vision. Now only see an unmade bed and a few unwashed cups on the bare wooden table of a gray day. So yeah, I had all these teachers in college who thought I had this enormous potential and they seemed excited about my future. What we usually refuse to acknowledge in our increasingly defensive posture is that we chose our royal inner trip out of an excess of blind faith, out of a reach beyond what we might have had if our desires had been less grandiose. Or the more grandiose your desires, the more grandiose your conception of yourself, the bigger the internal wound that you're trying to deal with. And so you can distract yourself from your inner wounds, but eventually the pain that comes from the dysfunction of always seeking distraction will likely overwhelm you And that's the time when you begin to do the work to heal. I think it is inherent in the American mystique to want to go all the way to the limit of your imagination. But if we are straight about it, we must accept that we are in large part responsible for the jam we are now in. So yeah, this is the beginning of wisdom, to look at our own responsibility for our own situation. I know only too well from childhood and adolescence, I clutched at the habit of dreaming up a glittering future instead of putting my head down and slugging my way through the present. So, what kind of person spends his time dreaming up a glittering future instead of putting his head down and slugging his way through the present? So it's someone who gets high from living a life of fantasy because the messiness of reality is too painful. In an almost reflexive sense, I still find myself doing this childish number. So dreaming up a glittering future rather than slugging his way through the present, as do many of these other poor, lovely romantics who are like me. Romantic, remember, sees more in reality than is really there. So this is talking about a Richard Spencer type character. It's a primitive method so native to us by now that it is part of us. What was once a psychological choice, well, it was a crutch, it was a distraction, it was a drug. When we're young, it's now become for many of us a bad habit. It's hard to kick as junk. So many of these habits that we develop for coping with our pain, they start out as adaptive habits that help us get through difficult times, but over time, these habits move from adaptive to maladaptive. And the handy magic of relying on the future, that can be adaptive when you're young, but you really want to move past that in your 20s. The handy magic of relying on the future, on tomorrow, to knit together all the parts of a self that we hoarded out for a lifetime, can't be stopped at this late date, or won't be stopped, because our frame of mind was always that of a long's odd gambler. Right, so expecting to make a living as a novelist or as an actor, that's a long odds gambler. So we develop these habits that start out as adaptive, then become maladaptive. So what we really want to do is we want to have reactions to stimuli that serve us rather than reactions that hurt us. We really want a calm central nervous system most of the time so that we can live in reality and navigate it successfully rather than always trying to get high through substances or processes or fantasies. We thought one day it would all pay off, but for most of us, that day will never come. The original hopes, their extravagant range and spaciousness, their lack of specific clarity and specific definition were beyond translation into deed. They dramatized our lives for a good long while and then turned slightly sour when people began to ask for proof. So for those who don't have a life of achievement, they often tend to substitute a life of drama. And so you'll find that people who lead very dramatic lives, they're always wrestling with drama with this person and that person. They don't tend to be accomplishing anything. So the alt-right, for example, was shooting to success in 2015 and 2016, but then when it encountered some turbulence at the end of 2016, it dissolved in useless drama. So people on the alt-right, they began focusing much more on their feuds with each other, on stupid adolescent drama, rather than trying to build something real. And it wasn't even out of choice. This was inherently who they were, because marginalized movements tend to attract marginalized people. Marginalized people tend to live much more in fantasy than in reality. And so it was the poorer quality of the people who were attracted to the alt-right that doomed the alt-right, just like it doomed previous white nationalist movements. This is a poor second to what I wanted. For a minority, the special form they seek to pull it all together will unexpectedly click into place after years of turning the key this way and that. As for myself, I'm lucky, I guess, in that I can write about this very phenomenon that I live, while others who experience it just as toughly, and maybe more so, without the words to tell you what they have gone through. So let's play a little bit of Seymour and the Krimstones here.
Does it feel to be an angry clown? Kevin James was great in The King of Queens. The things you make him do are downright mean. stand for hours just to shake your hand. But you just wait, go back to your town. I see you drive your Escalade, paid for by Chris Rock and David Spade. Sandler Town, let me hear it. Sandler Town. We all hope you're filmed as well when it comes out. Sandler Town.
So Seymour Krim decides, well, maybe I'm lucky than most because I have the ability to give words to what I'm going through. Most people are without the words to tell you what they're going through. So maybe that is my revelation, the final me. Maybe this is my purpose in the schemelessness of things, after looking so strenuously in all directions, becoming so discontented with what I can apparently do without strain. But, of course, this is a poor second to what he really wanted to achieve. I'll never be satisfied with sketching my own portrait and that of those like me, when it was action we finally craved, after all those dress rehearsals in the mind and not self-analysis. America worked on us too hard when you get right down to it. Well, no, it's much easier to blame it on America than to blame it on ourselves. We imaginatively lived out all the mythic possibilities. Well, people who live in a world of fantasy do this much more than those who live in reality. Or the personal turn-on of practically superhuman accomplishment stimulated by the fables of the media. Well, normal people can go watch TV and watch movies without getting high from it. But for people who lack ordinary connection, they're going to be much more susceptible to the hit that they get from living in grandiose dreams and fantasies. We were the perfect big-eye consumers of this country's four-color add to the universe, wanting to be one tempting thing and then another, and ending up, most of us, with little, but the sadly smiling hope that time would somehow solve our situation. When I've been brave, I've told my friends who share my plight that this is no longer a true possibility to hang on to. Time will most likely repeat itself. We will most likely repeat ourselves, and a few years later, he commits suicide. Most of my friends agree, and with that hard twinkle in the eye that unites all of us who have earned it. But you cannot separate us from the deepest promise of the country. And
Sandler Town, because the gifts that you bestow are so profound. Sandler Town, we all live here. Sandler Town.
everybody, Sandler Town, live in fantasy world of Sandler Town, cannot separate us from the deepest promise of the country as it was lived by the very sensitive poets without a tongue, perhaps the ultimate failure of the country. No, it's not a failure of the country. The failure is in ourselves. This last is not an easy thing to say, even in a time in which America baiting is the rage. So it's much easier here for him to displace his rage and disappointment and his failure on the country rather than on himself. Like most of us in the failure business, press 3 if you feel like you're in the failure business. We are patriots, so outrageously old-fashioned that we incorporated the spirit of the country in our very heads, took literally its every invitation to the greatest kind of self-fulfillment ever known. There's something beautiful about being an American sucker, even if you pay for it with tears and worse. We were millionaires of the spirit for at least 20 adult years before we felt the lowering of the boom. And in the last analysis, it is the spirit, the attitude within, a quality of soul this country has to offer to history, much more than its tangible steel and bright blood too often accompanying it. Wow, what an amazing essay there by Seymour Krim. To my brothers and sisters in the failure business.
How much cash does one adult child need? Sandler Town, I used to love it. Sandler Town. Still, there's no amount of money that can bring back Chris Farley.
Sandler Town by Seymour and the Krimtones, inspired by Seymour Krim. Okay, David Starkey has been through some difficult times.
Obviously, lots happened in the past year, but how is life for you at the moment?
Oh, life is fine. Remember, people think that things like cancellation are tremendously devastating. Well, the actual day or two was very unpleasant, but they somehow assume that it's the equivalent of a plague cross put upon you, that you become a social pariah. Nothing could be further, well, at least in my case, nothing could be further from the truth. A single person that I'd have sort of called a friend said, ugh.
Right.
And he was a rather typical rich man who wanted somebody amusing, on holiday company and that kind of thing. So that was nothing very terrible. There are aspects of it that fill me with horror, which, not personal horror, but institutional horror. The fact that learned bodies, for which I've been a very distinguished member for a very long period of time, drop you on entirely extraneous grounds. That something like the Royal Historical Society decides that a minor view on what is the right language to use about blacks is more important than 50 years of scholarship. That one's Cambridge College does the same. This is wholly destructive of any notion of scholarship. It is wholly destructive of institutions because it breaks that Burkean bond of generations of you go there as a student, you become a distinguished member, you become rich, you leave more money, which further endows the institution. You rupture all of that. You break it. And you break it for what? Feeling good. I think, frankly, it's contemptible. It's no accident that several of the individuals involved, like Dame, no, she's even grander, the Baroness Sally Morgan of Fitzwilliam College, they're new Labour apparatchiks. They're people of absolutely no intellectual distinction, no scholarship, no originality. They are simply mental policemen. But this is dangerous. This is Cambridge. Cambridge. We have a vice-chancellor. I say we. Wonderful. I'm liberated. I've got to break that habit. I'm no longer. I was there. I'm not there anymore. It's absolutely marvelous. Rewriting one's will was a pleasure. There was a moment when I thought of, it'd be quite a lot, of leaving it entirely to a cat's home on the ground that I hate cats. But I was a little wiser. But Cambridge, under its current vice-chancellor, the very appropriately named Toop, who for some reason or another was regarded as being promotional to Cambridge after having been the vice-chancellor of the University of British Columbia, has presided over this regime which prioritizes the alleged feelings of minority groups. Now, so Cambridge lies at the heart of the intellectual adventure of the last 500 years. Cambridge coming to prominence, it does literally 500 years ago. It's a complete second string to Oxford until the Tudor period, until my own period. And I find something very frightening that this institution, famously Trinity College with more Nobel Prizes in the whole of France, leads the charge in the reverse direction. Up to this year, and with an odd blip here and there, I would have thought of my life, and indeed of our society, as one of broadening freedom.
So the historian David Starkey, homosexual, he got cancelled for saying something politically incorrect about blacks. All right, I want to go back to this great 1989 essay by Tom Wolfe, Stalking the Billion-Footed Beast. So he notes, a strange fact of the matter was that young people with serious literary ambitions were no longer interested in the metropolis or any other big, rich slice of contemporary life. Over the preceding 15 years, while I'd been immersed in journalism, one of the most curious chapters in American literary history had begun. It is not over yet. The story is by turns bizarre and hilarious, and one day some lucky doctoral candidate will do it justice. I can offer no more than the broadest outline. After the Second World War and in the late 1940s, American intellectuals began to revive a dream that had glowed briefly in the 1920s. They set out to create a native intelligentsia on the French or English model, an intellectual aristocracy, socially unaffiliated, beyond class distinctions, active in politics and the arts. So what happens when you have an aristocracy beyond class distinctions? They have particular ways of speaking and seeing the world that can only be acquired through some effort. So that's what wokeism, knowing what's the latest woke fetish, that is the ticket that entitles you to belong to this class. In the arts, their audience would be the inevitably small minority of truly cultivated people, as opposed to the mob, who wished only to be entertained or to be assured that they were cultured. By now, the mob was better known as the middle class. So a few weeks ago, I talked about a great book, The Intellectuals versus the Masses. So I talked about starting around 1890 in Europe. Europe's intellectuals demonstrated increasing disgust with the great masses of people, because in the late 19th century, you had growing rates of literacy. So literacy almost became universal in England and in France and in Germany. And so how now could you distinguish yourself from the great masses who were literate? Well, by acquiring tastes that were quite distinct from the great masses of people. So the ultimate culmination of this modernist trend was Adolf Hitler, who despised the masses. And his views, however, on art and on literature were largely indistinguishable from the other great literary intellectuals in Europe over the previous 40 years. Among the fashionable European ideas that began to circulate was that of the death of the novel, which was meant the realistic novel. So writing in 1948, Lionel Trilling, who was the first Jew to get tenure in English literature, he got it at Columbia University, he gave this notion a late Marxist twist. The realistic novel was the literary child of the 19th century industrial bourgeoisie. So the industrial bourgeoisie became almost universally literate in the 19th century. The realistic novel was a slice of life, a cross-section that provided a true and powerful picture of individuals and society, only as long as the bourgeois order and that all-class system was firmly in place. But now that the bourgeoisie was in a state of crisis and partial rout, and the all-class system was crumbling, the realistic novel, from this Marxist perspective, was pointless. What could be more futile than a cross-section of disintegrating fragments? So the intelligentsia have always had contempt for the tastes of the masses, right? The way that you get to be elite is by distinguishing yourself from the masses, just as academics, generally speaking, have contempt for popular forms of media. So the intelligentsia have always had contempt for the realistic novel because it's a form that wallows so enthusiastically in the dirt of everyday life and the dirty secrets of class envy. And what's worse, it is easily understood and appreciated and relished by the mob, i.e. the middle class. So in Victorian England, the intelligentsia regarded Charles Dickens as the author of the uneducated, undiscriminating public. And it required about 80 years to separate his work from its vulgar milieu so that Charles Dickens, starting about 1920s, became canonized in British literary circles. So the intelligentsia have always preferred more refined forms of fiction, such as that longtime French intellectual favorite, the psychological novel. By the early 1960s, the notion of the death of the realistic novel had caught on among young American writers with the force of revelation. This was an extraordinary turnabout because in the 1930s, we had this explosion of these great big realistic novels with their broad social sweep. These novels put American literature up on the world stage. In the 1930s, Sinclair Lewis, a realistic novelist, used reporting technique as thoroughly as Émile Zola in France. He became the first American writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. In his acceptance speech, he called on his fellow writers to give America a literature worthy of her vastness. 4 of the next 5 Americans to win the Nobel Prize in Literature were realistic novelists: Pearl Buck, William Faulkner, Ernest Hemingway, John Steinbeck. The 5th was the playwright Eugene O'Neill. And the most highly regarded new novelists of the immediate post-World War II era, James Jones, Norman Mailer, Irwin Shaw, William Styron, Corder Willingham, were all realists. Here's David Starkey.
There's a sudden sense of reversal. I don't know whether I said it when I appeared on this program. I think I probably did. In other words, immediately in the aftermath of the first lockdown, at the onset of COVID. I think I said, did I not? You have a good memory, you may remember. A Chinese virus, a Chinese society. And that's what we're doing. And we're reversing. It's quite extraordinary. We are reversing values. And we're doing it, of course, at the moment of the most desperate danger. That the only thing that we have faced with China, faced with India, we're a tiny little place. The dot is that originality, that creativity, that mental adventurism that made us, for some hundred years, some hundreds of years, the cutting edge of this astonishing post-Reformation, post-Renaissance work.
So yeah, the West has developed and created almost everything because the West is more adventurous, more individualistic. Almost all the great universities of the world are in the West. GSP is back. He's been in the chat for approximately 5 years. Luke was wild and crazy back in the day, and America was his queen. She was wilder and crazier than him, and God help anyone who dared to criticize his America. So Tom Wolfe writes, in Stalking the Billion-Footed Beast, his famous 1989 essay for Harper's Magazine, yet by 1962, when John Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize, young writers and intellectuals regarded him and his approach to the novel as an embarrassment, Pearl Buck was even worse. Sinclair Lewis wasn't much better. Faulkner and Hemingway commanded respect, but it was the kind of respect you give to old boys who did their best they could with what they knew in their day. They were squares who thought you could take real life and spread it across the pages of a book. They never comprehended that a novel is a sublime literary game. So you sense that with many novels these days, that the writer's just trying to play a game rather than trying to take life and spread it across the pages of a book. Or serious young writers, serious meaning those who aim for literary prestige, understood these things. They were dismantling the realistic novel just as fast as they could think of ways to do it. The dividing line was the year 1960. Writers who went to college after 1960 understood. For a serious young writer to stick with realism after 1960 required contrariness and courage. Writers who had gone to college before 1960, such as Saul Bellow, Robert Stone, and John Updike, Philip Roth, found it hard to give up realism, but many others were caught betwixt and between. They didn't know which way to turn. For example, Philip Roth, the 1954 graduate of Bucknell, won the National Book Award in 1960 at the age of 27 for a collection entitled Goodbye, Columbus. The title piece was a brilliant novella of manners, brilliant but highly realistic. By 1961, Roth was having second thoughts. He made a statement that had a terrific impact on other young writers. We now live in an age, he said, in which the imagination of the novelist lies helpless before what he knows he will read in tomorrow morning's newspaper. The actuality is continually outdoing our talents, and the culture tosses up figures daily that are the envy of any novelist.
But we're throwing it away. It's quite extraordinary. It's there's a famous model at the castle of Loches or Chinon under Louis XI, where unwanted ministers were locked up in iron cages. We're going into an iron cage voluntarily. We're closing the door. We're turning the locks ourselves and throwing the keys away. It's great being old. You don't really care. I mean, if lots of these nice young people choose to commit intellectual and political suicide, economic suicide, well, fine. So long as one's investments last, who cares?
When this thing happened last year, I mean, you have said I think your mother once said, your tongue will get you into trouble. I think you said that on this show when you were on before. But were you surprised?
I think I was. Let's just investigate that. It, of course, did finally get me into trouble, but equally it was the entire making of my previous career. This is the point that I'm trying to get about, the astonishing reversal that remember, all human progress depends on naysaying.
Okay, let's have a look at the chat. John Berkshire says, genetic explanations for why the West dominates the world don't really add up. That domination only began in 1500, wasn't a major genetic change in 1500. Well, not quite. So, for example, Ashkenazi Jews arrived in Europe approximately 1100 years ago, and by the 14th century, a majority of their males, adult males, were making a living in white-collar business, money lending, and the like. So, historically, there was no notion of Jews having superior intelligence, but due to certain conditions in Europe, those Jews who were able to make money were able to reproduce. And those Jews who weren't able to make money in white-collar endeavors were not able to reproduce. So therefore, you had the reproduction of the more intelligent Jews. So this created a virtuous eugenic cycle that steadily increased the average IQ of Ashkenazi Jews. Now, in Europe, you had the Black Death. And so the Black Death killed, about half the population of Europe, and generally it was quite eugenic. It was the less intelligent who were the more likely to die. So the plague arrived in Europe in 1347, and so the Black Death killed about a third of the people in Europe, about 20 million people. So those who survived, they were able to get much higher wages, and they were more intelligent on average than those who died. And so they would mate with each other, creating a eugenic trend. So for more explanations on this theory, what's the book? By Nicholas Wade. Nicholas